Velma Barfield was convicted and sentenced to die in 1978 for the poisoning death of her boyfriend. She also admitted poisoning 3 other people, including her mother. Barfield had been awaiting her sentence in the Women's Correctional Facility in Raleigh. But last week, for security reasons, say corrections officials, she was moved to Raleigh's Central Prison, where she is the only woman prisoner. She now waits in virtual isolation in a cell just across from the execution chamber, a constant reminder, she says, of her likely fate.
It's total, isolation from everybody that I had been with for almost 6 years. The first week I was here was the worst week that I have spent.
Her attorney would not allow her to say whether she knew what she was doing when she committed her crimes. But once confined in prison, Barfield says, she found God. It's her relationship with God, she says, that has enabled her to survive her confinement.
Living in prison every day is a struggle, even at its best. And I know that without him and his strength that has sustained me, I couldn't have made it even thus far.
After 6 years on death row, Velma Barfield faced her end in North Carolina. She was 52 years old when the lethal injection took her life inside the death chamber at Central Prison in Raleigh. By then, her name was already written into the state's history as the grandmother who became a serial killer, the first woman executed in America in 22 years, and the first white woman to face the death penalty since it came back in 1976. At 2:15 in the morning on November 2, 1984, Velma was declared dead, her last words an apology for the hurt she had caused, though people still argued about whether she truly meant it or was just playing a part. In her final days, Velma had made one last request. She wanted to donate her organs, to give life to people who may need it, even as the state took hers. But the chemicals used in lethal injection made her body unfit for transplant. Even this final act was denied, leaving only questions about who Velma Barfield really was, a sorry Christian looking for forgiveness, or a clever killer playing her last card. The execution caused controversy across the nation, not just because of what she had done, but because of who she was. A white woman, a grandmother, a church regular who made blankets and quoted the Bible. In a justice system where women, especially white women, almost never face the death penalty, Velma Barfield became the rare exception. Her case would force America to face hard questions about gender, race, and whether what a killer looks like should matter when deciding who lives and who dies. It was February 1st, 1978, in the quiet farmlands near Lumberton, North Carolina. The winter evening seemed peaceful and normal. Inside a simple white farmhouse with a pointed roof lived Stuart Taylor, a 56-year-old tobacco farmer and widower. He was a good man, known around town for his honest work and kind heart, excited about becoming a grandfather soon. He had no idea that the woman living in his home had already decided he had to die. The arsenic had been bought days earlier. The rat poison, easy to get and deadly, sat waiting. No one suspected that behind her warm smile and grandmother's kindness was a mind that had already taken 3 other lives. Over 3 days, poison was mixed into Stuart's beer and tea. Each drink carried another dose of death, slow and painful. The sickness came fast: bad vomiting, sharp stomach pain, constant diarrhea. Stuart's body was being destroyed from the inside, bit by bit, as arsenic attacked his organs. Velma sat by his hospital bed, acting like a worried partner, holding his hand as he suffered. She never told the doctors what was really wrong. She never said anything about the medicine that could have saved his life. On February 3, 1978, Stuart Taylor died in terrible pain, his organs failing one by one. The death certificate said natural causes. No one thought it was murder. No one imagined that the crying woman at his funeral had watched him die slowly, staying quiet when he could have been saved. And no one knew that Stuart was the 4th victim in a line of poisonings going back years. A trail of dead bodies that included Velma's own mother. By the time his daughter Alice demanded an autopsy, 3 lives had already been taken, their deaths made to look like sickness. But Stuart's death would be different. The test results would show the truth hidden in his body: deadly levels of arsenic. and that discovery would uncover a string of murders hidden behind the face of a quiet church lady, a loving grandmother, a woman no one thought could kill. But to understand how Velma Barfield, a mother and grandmother, became the name tied to one of North Carolina's most shocking serial murder cases, how years of addiction to prescription pills led her down a road of stealing, forgery, and finally poison, how she killed 4 people, maybe 6, including her own mother, and why her case started a national argument about gender, justice, and second chances that still matters today. We have to go back to a childhood filled with poverty and terrible abuse. Back to the moment when pills became more important than human life. Back to the pattern of theft and murder that happened again and again, until the day Stuart Taylor's family refused to believe that a healthy man had just dropped dead and demanded answers that would expose a killer hiding in plain sight. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth, real cases, real consequences, the darkest corners of human decision, broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. Margie Velma Bullard entered the world on October 29, 1932, in Eastover, South Carolina. She was the second of 9 children born to Murphy and Lily Bullard. The family lived on a small tobacco and cotton farm near Wade, North Carolina, where poverty defined every aspect of daily life. The Bullard home had no electricity, no running water, and not even an outhouse. Young Velma learned to walk into the woods when nature called. The family shared tight quarters, and Velma slept in the same bedroom as her parents throughout her childhood and into her high school years. Murphy Bullard worked the late shift at Burlington Mills, repairing looms in the textile factory. His absence during evening hours meant Velma rarely saw her father during her younger years. When he was home, the atmosphere changed. Murphy had a volatile temper that erupted without warning. Lily Bullard, Velma's mother, bore the brunt of Murphy's anger. The children witnessed their father's physical violence against their mother regularly. Velma grew to fear her father deeply, and that fear shaped her childhood in ways that would echo throughout her life. As Velma started first grade at age 7, she became painfully aware of her family's economic status. Her classmates wore clean, well-maintained clothes. Velma wore worn and tattered garments that marked her as poor. The other children noticed, and some bullied her because of it. The contrast between her life and those of her peers troubled Velma. She wanted the small things other children had: hair ribbons, nicer shoes, pocket money for treats. At home, there was never money for such luxuries. The family struggled to put food on the table. Velma began stealing pocket money from her father. At first, it was just a few coins here and there to buy small items at school. The theft made her feel less different from her classmates, at least temporarily. But the deception grew bolder. One day, Velma stole $80 from an elderly neighbor. The amount was substantial, especially for a poor farming family in the 1940s. When Murphy Bullard discovered what his daughter had done, his reaction was violent. He beat Velma so severely that she later said it was the last time she stole anything during her childhood. But the violence in the Bullard home went beyond beatings for misbehavior. Years later, during her appeals process, Velma would reveal darker truths about her father. She claimed Murphy sexually abused her throughout her adolescent years. According to Velma, when she was 13 years old and homesick from school with the flu, her father raped her. Velma's sister, Faye Paul, later confirmed that their father attempted similar abuse with her. The girl's mother, Lily, apparently knew about the abuse but did nothing to protect her daughters. This failure to intervene left Velma feeling both violated and abandoned. The Bullard family attended church regularly. They were raised in a strict Pentecostal Christian household. Twice each summer, Velma went to Presbyterian Bible school. Religion was woven into the fabric of their lives, yet it did nothing to stop the violence and abuse happening behind closed doors. By her teenage years, Velma had taken on adult responsibilities. She cooked all the family's meals each day, caring for her younger siblings while navigating the dangers of her own home. The weight of these responsibilities, combined with the abuse, made Velma desperate for escape. As Velma approached her 16th birthday, she knew she needed to leave. Marriage offered the only socially acceptable exit for a young woman in rural North Carolina in the late 1940s. She just needed to find someone who would take her away from the Bullard farm and the father she feared. That escape would come soon, but it would lead Velma down a path no one could have predicted. When the Bullard family moved to Robeson County, Velma met Thomas Burke. He was a local boy, the kind of steady young man who might offer a girl from a troubled home a chance at something better. For Velma, Thomas represented more than romance. He represented freedom. Velma began attending the Baptist church with Thomas and his family. She was baptized there, embracing the religious community that welcomed her. The church activities gave her reasons to be away from home, away from her father. After waiting for her 16th birthday, Velma started dating Thomas officially. They spent time together at church functions, movies, and local gatherings. Thomas worked at a textile mill in Red Springs, earning steady wages. He seemed like someone who could provide stability. Thomas proposed to Velma at a local movie theater. She accepted immediately. Marriage meant she could finally leave her parents' house. She could escape the abuse, the poverty, and the suffocating environment of the Bullard farm. Velma dropped out of school in the 10th grade. On her wedding day, she was just 17 years old. Thomas quit his job at the textile mill, and the young couple moved in with Thomas's parents. The early years brought what Velma had hoped for, distance from her father and a chance to build a different kind of life. Thomas eventually found new work, and they moved to their own place near Velma's parents in Wade. Despite the proximity to the Bullard farm, Velma now had her own household. By age 19, Velma had given birth to 2 children. Her son Ronald, called Ronnie, came first, followed by a daughter named Kim. For more than 15 years, the Burke family appeared stable and happy. Neighbors saw them as a normal family unit, Thomas working, Velma keeping house and raising the children. Thomas drove a Pepsi truck for a living, and the job provided enough income to support the family. Velma focused on her children and home, attending church regularly. The violence and chaos of her childhood seemed far behind her. But Velma's body bore hidden damage from her past. She began working at a textile plant, following in her father's footsteps in the local industry that employed so many in the area. Shortly after starting the job, medical issues forced her to stop working. But Velma's body bore hidden damage from her past. She began working at a textile plant, following in her father's footsteps in the local industry that employed so many in the area. Shortly after starting the job, medical issues forced her to stop working. Velma experienced severe gynecological problems that required immediate medical attention. A hysterectomy, the surgical removal of the uterus, became necessary. The surgery was major. Doctors removed Velma's uterus, permanently ending her ability to bear children. At the time, she was only in her early 30s with 2 children already. From a purely medical standpoint, the surgery solved whatever condition threatened her health. But the psychological impact extended far beyond the physical recovery. In 1960s rural North Carolina, a woman's identity was deeply tied to her reproductive capacity. Being a wife and mother defined female worth in that conservative religious community. The ability to bear children represented fundamental womanhood. The surgery also came with physical consequences that would prove significant. The hysterectomy left Velma with chronic back pain. This wasn't uncommon. The surgery involves cutting through abdominal muscles and can affect the pelvic floor and spine alignment. Some women develop lasting pain after the procedure, particularly when performed through certain surgical approaches common in the 1960s. The pain was real and persistent. It interfered with Velma's daily activities and quality of life. She returned to her doctors seeking relief from the constant discomfort. The medical response was typical for that era. Prescribed pain medication. Doctors wrote prescriptions for painkillers to help Velma cope with the discomfort. These prescriptions marked Velma's first introduction to the pills that would eventually consume her life. For Velma, the medications did more than ease back pain. They dulled the emotional pain of feeling incomplete, of struggling in a difficult marriage, of managing a household and children while dealing with chronic discomfort. The pills made everything more bearable. This was the beginning of a dependency that would define the rest of Velma's life. What started as legitimate pain management after necessary surgery evolved into addiction. Velma discovered that pills could make problems, physical and emotional, feel less overwhelming. That discovery would lead her down a path toward theft, fraud, and eventually murder. Then, in 1965, everything changed. Thomas Burke was involved in a serious automobile accident. The crash left him with severe injuries, particularly to his head. The pain from his injuries was intense and unrelenting. Thomas suffered from constant debilitating headaches. Doctors prescribed medications for Thomas's pain. But the pills weren't enough. Thomas turned to alcohol, drinking heavily to numb the suffering the accident had caused. His personality changed. The steady, reliable man Velma had married became someone different. The couple's once peaceful home became a battleground. Thomas's drinking escalated from occasional to regular to constant. Velma, who had always detested alcohol because of her father's drinking binges, found herself married to an alcoholic. The arguments between them grew bitter and frequent. Thomas could no longer work due to his injuries. The loss of income meant Velma had to find employment. She got a job at a store, becoming the family's primary breadwinner. The reversal of traditional roles added strain to an already troubled marriage. Velma found herself living a nightmare that felt familiar. She had escaped one troubled home only to find herself in another. The stress mounted daily. She returned to doctors complaining of anxiety and depression. They wrote prescriptions, Librium and Valium, tranquilizers to help her cope. Velma began taking the pills regularly. She visited multiple doctors, obtaining prescriptions from each. No single physician knew how many pills she was consuming. The medications blurred the edges of her reality, making her days more bearable. By the late 1960s, Velma's life had become defined by stress, pills, and an increasingly volatile marriage. The girl who had sought escape through marriage found herself trapped again. April 4, 1969, began like many difficult days in the Burke household. Thomas had been drinking heavily, his alcoholism now a constant presence in their lives. Velma, exhausted from working and managing two teenage children, felt the weight of their deteriorating marriage. That evening, Thomas drank until he passed out. This had become routine, Thomas unconscious from alcohol while Velma handled everything else. The children, Ronnie and Kim, had witnessed their father's decline over the past 4 years. They knew when to stay out of the way. At some point that night, Velma made a decision. She gathered the children and left the house. They drove away, leaving Thomas alone, unconscious in their home. Where they went, or how long they stayed away, the records don't specify. But when Velma and the children returned, they found their house engulfed in flames. Firefighters arrived to battle the blaze. By the time they brought the fire under control, significant damage had destroyed parts of the house. More devastating, they found Thomas Burke's body inside. He had died from smoke inhalation. The investigation into Thomas's death concluded it was an accident. The official story suggested that Thomas, in his intoxicated state, had likely dropped a lit cigarette. The cigarette ignited materials in the house, and the fire spread while Thomas remained unconscious. Unable to wake or escape, he succumbed to the smoke. The Robsonian newspaper ran a brief notice about the death on April 22, 1969. The headline read simply, "Parkton man succumbs to smoke inhalation." The article treated it as a tragic accident, but nothing more. No one suspected foul play. No one questioned Velma's account of events. Velma became a widow at age 36. She and her children moved back to her parents' home, returning to the Bullard farm she had left so many years before. Velma grieved publicly, attending Thomas's funeral and accepting condolences from friends and neighbors. Only a few months after Thomas Burke's death, Velma began dating again. The man was Jennings Barfield, a widower who lived in the area. Like Velma, Jennings had lost a spouse and was trying to rebuild his life. He had children from his first marriage and understood the complications of being a single parent. Jennings Barfield was 54 years old when he met Velma. He suffered from emphysema and diabetes, chronic conditions that required ongoing medical management. Despite his health issues, Jennings maintained his independence and his own household. For Velma, Jennings represented another chance at stability. He had resources, a home, and seemed to care for her. The relationship moved quickly, as relationships often did in that era and community. In August 1970, less than a year and a half after Thomas Burke's death, Velma and Jennings married. Velma moved into Jennings's home, bringing Ronnie and Kim with her. The blended family tried to establish routines. Jennings's health required attention. He took multiple medications for his emphysema and diabetes, and Velma, who had experience caring for Thomas during his decline, took on the role of Jennings's primary caregiver. The marriage showed cracks almost immediately. Velma and Jennings argued frequently. The sources of their conflicts varied: money, the children, household responsibilities, Jennings's health. The fights grew heated, with both parties saying things they couldn't take back. Velma's drug use continued. She was taking prescription medications regularly, visiting different doctors to maintain her supply of tranquilizers and painkillers. The pills affected her mood, her judgment, and her ability to manage stress. When conflicts arose with Jennings, Velma lacked the emotional tools to handle them constructively. After one particularly intense argument, Jennings became mysteriously ill. He developed symptoms that seemed to worsen his existing respiratory problems. He had difficulty breathing, experienced severe vomiting, and suffered from diarrhea. These symptoms suggested a serious complication of his emphysema, or perhaps a separate acute illness. Jennings's condition deteriorated rapidly. On March 22, 1971, just 7 months after marrying Velma, Jennings Barfield died. The death certificate listed heart failure as the cause, which seemed consistent with his known health problems. A man with emphysema and diabetes dying of heart complications raised no red flags. No autopsy was performed. Jennings's family accepted that his chronic health conditions had finally caught up with him. Velma grieved, attended the funeral, and once again found herself widowed. She and her children moved back to her parents' house for the second time in less than 2 years. The pattern that would later become clear to investigators was already emerging, but no one saw it yet. 2 husbands, both dead under circumstances that appeared natural or accidental. Jennings Barfield was laid to rest, and his death became just another sad story in a small North Carolina community. His children from his first marriage continued their lives. Among them was a grandson named Jonathan Bird, who would grow up to become a singer-songwriter. Years later, Jonathan Bird would write a song called Velma for his album Wildflowers. The song would give a personal account of what happened to his grandfather and the investigation that eventually followed. But in 1971, that future remained unknown. What also remained unknown in 1971 was what actually killed Jennings Barfield. Velma's father would be the next member of the household to die, but his death would be one of the few Velma wasn't responsible for. After Jennings Barfield's death, Velma's drug use accelerated. The prescriptions that had started as treatment for legitimate pain and anxiety had become something else entirely. Velma was now addicted to a cocktail of medications: Valium, Librium, Sinequan, Elevil, Tylenol with codeine. The list grew as she sought out multiple doctors. Living back at her parents' house at age 38 felt like failure. Velma had married at 17 to escape this place, and now she was back with 2 teenagers and no prospects. Her father Murphy still worked at the textile mill. Her mother Lily kept house, as she had for decades. Murphy's health began to fail in 1972. He developed lung cancer, likely from years of smoking and working in textile mills breathing cotton dust. The cancer spread, and Murphy's condition worsened steadily. In late 1972, Murphy Bullard died. This death was natural, unconnected to Velma's actions. With Murphy's death, Velma and her mother Lily were left sharing the household. Ronnie and Kim were getting older, approaching adulthood. The family dynamics shifted. Velma and her mother had never been close. Velma still harbored resentment that her mother had failed to protect her from her father's abuse. Velma's addiction continued to drain whatever money came into the household. Prescription medications weren't cheap, and Velma needed increasing amounts to maintain the numbed state she had come to depend on. Between 1972 and 1975, Velma overdosed on prescription medications 4 separate times, requiring hospitalization each time. The overdoses showed that Velma's drug use had passed the point of therapeutic into the realm of substance abuse. Each hospitalization should have triggered interventions, but the medical system of the early 1970s didn't have the frameworks we have today for addressing prescription drug addiction. Velma's need for money to buy pills led her back to theft. She began writing bad checks, forging signatures, and taking out loans in other people's names. The schemes were clumsy and easily detected. In 1975, Velma was arrested and convicted of 7 counts of writing bad checks. The court sentenced Velma to 6 months in the North Carolina Correctional Center for Women in Raleigh. She served 4 months before being released early for good behavior. The prison time forced Velma into withdrawal from her medications. She experienced the physical and psychological agony of coming off the drugs without medical support. After her release from prison, Velma returned home. She needed to find work to support herself, but her criminal record made finding employment difficult. Her options were limited by her lack of education. She had dropped out in 10th grade, and her recent conviction. The jobs available to women like Velma in mid-1970s North Carolina were limited. She could work in textile mills, in retail, or in service positions. But there was another option: private nursing care for the elderly. Families often needed someone to help care for aging relatives, especially those who wanted to remain in their homes rather than enter nursing facilities. Velma found work as a caregiver. The position didn't require formal nursing credentials. It required someone willing to help with daily tasks, prepare meals, provide companionship, and assist with medications. Velma's experience caring for her deceased husbands made her seem qualified. In 1976, Velma secured a position with an elderly couple in Lumberton, Montgomery and Dolly Edwards. Montgomery was 94 years old. Dolly was 84. They needed help managing their household and their health conditions. Velma moved into their home, receiving room and board plus $75 per week. The arrangement seemed beneficial for everyone. The Edwards couple got assistance from someone who seemed caring and capable. Velma got steady income, a place to live, and escape from her mother's house. She was 43 years old, trying to rebuild her life after prison, addiction, and 2 dead husbands. But Velma's drug addiction hadn't disappeared. Within months of starting work with the Edwards family, Velma was again visiting multiple doctors, obtaining prescriptions for tranquilizers and painkillers. The need for pills drove her behavior, and pills cost money. Living in someone else's home, Velma had access to their financial documents, their checkbooks, their personal information. The temptation proved too strong. Velma began forging small checks, taking amounts she thought wouldn't be noticed immediately. She used the stolen money to pay for her medications. Montgomery Edwards had lived a long life. At 94, he had seen the turn of the century, 2 world wars, and the transformation of rural North Carolina. His body bore the accumulated wear of nearly a century of living. He moved slowly, needed help with basic tasks, and relied on Velma for much of his daily care. Velma prepared Montgomery's meals, helped him with bathing and dressing, and managed his medications. The intimate nature of caregiving meant Velma had complete access to Montgomery's food and drink. She knew his routines, his habits, and his vulnerabilities. In January 1977, Montgomery became ill. The symptoms started gradually: stomach pain, nausea, vomiting. At 94, illness wasn't unusual. His body's ability to fight off infections had diminished with age. What seemed like a stomach virus or food poisoning progressed rapidly. Montgomery's condition worsened despite Velma's care, or perhaps because of it. On January 29, 1977, Montgomery Edwards died. The death certificate listed natural causes, which seemed appropriate for a man of 94. No autopsy was performed. The family accepted that Montgomery had simply reached the end of his long life. Dolly Edwards mourned her husband of many decades. The death left her alone in the house with Velma. At 84, Dolly was younger and healthier than Montgomery had been, but she still needed assistance. She asked Velma to stay on as her caregiver. Velma agreed to continue working for Dolly. The arrangement meant Velma kept her income and housing, but it also meant Dolly would eventually review the household finances more carefully. Montgomery had handled most of their money matters. Now Dolly would need to understand where their money was going. The forged checks Velma had written would come to light. The loans taken out in the Edwards names would be discovered. Velma's theft, which she had managed to hide while Montgomery was alive, was about to be exposed. She needed time to figure out how to handle the situation. Just over a month after Montgomery's death, Dolly Edwards began experiencing symptoms identical to those her husband had suffered. She developed severe stomach pain, intense vomiting, and diarrhea. The symptoms appeared suddenly and progressed quickly. Dolly's family took her to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't determine what was causing her illness. They treated her symptoms, trying to stabilize her condition, but whatever was affecting Dolly proved resistant to treatment. On March 1, 1977, just over a month after her husband's death, Dolly Edwards died. The Lee family welcomed Velma into their home in early 1977. John Henry Lee was 80 years old, a man who had lived through the Depression and built a life in Lumberton. His wife, Record, at 76, was recovering from a broken leg. The couple needed help, and Velma seemed like the answer to their needs. Velma settled into the Lee household, taking on the familiar duties of cooking, cleaning, and helping with personal care. John Henry and Record trusted Velma with intimate aspects of their daily lives. She prepared their meals, helped with bathing and dressing, and managed medications. As with the Edwards family, Velma had complete access to the Lee home. She could enter any room, open any drawer, and handle any document. This access included checkbooks, financial records, and personal identification documents. And as before, Velma's drug addiction drove her to steal. Velma began forging checks on the Lee family accounts. She started small, $50 here, $100 there. She used the money to pay for her prescription medications, which she obtained from multiple doctors. The theft was risky, especially since Velma had been caught and convicted of forgery before. John Henry Lee handled the family finances. When he reviewed their bank statements, he noticed discrepancies, checks he didn't remember writing, amounts that didn't match his records. He began to suspect that someone was stealing from them, and the only person with access to their checkbooks was Velma. Velma realized that John Henry had discovered her theft. She faced the same problem she had encountered with the Edwards family. Her crimes were about to be exposed. A second conviction for forgery would mean a much longer prison sentence. She would face years behind bars, and the withdrawal from her medications would be agonizing. In June 1977, John Henry Lee began to feel unwell. The symptoms started with stomach pain that grew increasingly severe. He experienced racking pains in his chest, making him wonder if he was having a heart attack. Violent vomiting and diarrhea followed. John Henry's condition deteriorated over the following days. At 80 years old, his body couldn't withstand the assault. On June 4, 1977, John Henry Lee died. The medical report listed the cause of death as a heart attack, complicated by what appeared to be a severe stomach virus. The doctors who treated John Henry in his final days didn't suspect poisoning. An 80-year-old man dying of heart failure seemed entirely natural. The gastrointestinal symptoms could be explained by any number of causes. No one ordered toxicology tests or an autopsy. Record Lee, grieving her husband and still recovering from her broken leg, had no reason to suspect the woman who had been caring for them both. Velma had seemed devoted to John Henry, attending to him constantly during his illness. She had shown appropriate distress at his suffering. Velma attended John Henry's funeral, offering condolences to the family. She had now poisoned several persons to death. The pattern was clear. Velma stole money to feed her drug addiction, and when discovery threatened, she poisoned her victims. After John Henry's death, Velma continued working for Record Lee for a short time. But Record no longer needed full-time care. Her leg was healing, and she had family members who could help her. Velma needed to find other work and another place to live. The death of John Henry Lee would haunt his daughters for years. Sylvia Lee Andrews and Margie Lee Pittman would later learn that their father's death was not natural. When Velma Barfield was finally arrested, his body would be exhumed and tested for poison. The results would confirm what had really happened. But in the summer of 1977, no one knew. John Henry Lee was buried, his death attributed to natural causes. His daughters mourned him, believing he had died of heart failure. Velma moved on to her next situation, her next victim. That victim would be someone closer to Velma than any of the others. Someone who had raised her, who knew her better than anyone. Someone whose death would be the most personal, the most cruel, and in many ways the most revealing about who Velma Barfield had become. Velma's mother, Lillian Bullard, had lived alone since Murphy's death in 1972. At 74 years old, Lily maintained her independence in the family home where Velma had grown up. But living alone became increasingly difficult as she aged. Family members visited regularly, but Lily needed more consistent help. Velma, now without steady employment after leaving the Lee household, returned to her mother's house. The reunion brought complicated feelings for both women. They had never been close. Velma harbored deep resentment toward her mother for failing to protect her from her father's abuse. Lily, for her part, struggled with her daughter's problems. She knew about Velma's drug addiction, her criminal conviction for forgery, and her inability to maintain stable employment. The relationship between mother and daughter was strained at best. But despite their troubled history, they were family. Lily needed help, and Velma needed a place to stay. The arrangement made practical sense even if it brought emotional difficulty. Velma moved back into her childhood home once again. Velma's drug addiction continued unabated. She needed money for her prescriptions, and she needed it regularly. Living with her mother, Velma had access to Lily's finances. The temptation proved irresistible. Velma began taking out loans in her mother's name without Lily's knowledge or permission. The first loan was for $1,000. Velma forged her mother's signature on the loan documents and used the money to pay for her medications. She thought she could repay the loan before her mother discovered it, but Velma couldn't control her drug use, and the money disappeared quickly. In the summer of 1974, Lily began receiving overdue notices from the loan company. She hadn't taken out any loan. She contacted Velma, confused and concerned about the notices. Velma made excuses, said it must be a mistake, promised to look into it. Then Lily fell ill. The symptoms came on suddenly: severe stomach pain, intense vomiting, and diarrhea. The illness seemed to be some kind of acute gastric problem. Lily was admitted to a hospital, where doctors treated her symptoms. After several days, she recovered and was sent home. The near-death experience frightened Lily, but she resumed her normal life. She continued to receive notices about the loan. The questions about the money persisted. Velma needed to prevent her mother from investigating further, from potentially discovering the full extent of her daughter's theft. In December 1974, during the Christmas season, Lily Bullard became ill again. The symptoms were identical to her previous illness: agonizing stomach pain, violent vomiting, severe diarrhea. This time, the symptoms came on even more suddenly and progressed more rapidly. Family members rushed Lily to the hospital. On December 30th, 1974, just 2 hours after being admitted, Lillian Bullard died. She was 74 years old. The doctors couldn't determine what had killed her. They had no diagnosis for her fatal illness. No autopsy was performed. The family accepted that Lily had died from some unknown but acute medical condition. Perhaps a perforated ulcer, or internal bleeding, or a severe infection. At 74, death from sudden illness wasn't shocking. The family grieved and laid Lily to rest. Velma mourned publicly. She had lost both parents now, her father to lung cancer and her mother to a mysterious illness. Friends and family offered sympathy. No one suspected that Velma had poisoned her own mother with the same rat poison she had used on Dolly Edwards and John Henry Lee. Stuart Taylor was a tobacco farmer and widower living near Lumberton. At 56 years old, he had lived his entire life in rural North Carolina. He owned land, raised crops, and maintained a biz. The death of Lillian Bullard represented a new depth to Velma's crimes. Killing elderly clients was cruel, but they were essentially strangers. Killing her own mother crossed a different line. It spoke to a profound moral disconnect, a willingness to murder even family members to protect her secrets and feed her addiction. With her mother dead, Velma inherited the family house. She now had a place to live and some financial breathing room, but she also had an escalating addiction that continued to demand more money, more pills, more desperate measures to obtain them. But Velma's final victim would be different. He wouldn't be an elderly, vulnerable person under her care. He would be a man her own age, someone she was involved with romantically, someone whose family would refuse to accept his death as natural. And that refusal would finally expose Velma Barfield's crimes: farmhouse with distinctive white walls and a steeple-shaped roof. Stuart was known as a decent man, hard-working, honest, and well-liked in the community. Stuart had children from his previous marriage, including a daughter named Alice who was pregnant with her first child. He was close with his kids and looked forward to becoming a grandfather. His life had settled into a comfortable routine after losing his wife. Stuart Taylor was also related to Dolly Edwards, the elderly woman Velma had poisoned in March 1977. Through this family connection, Stuart met Velma Barfield. She was 44, recently unemployed after John Henry Lee's death, and looking for both work and companionship. Stuart and Velma began a relationship sometime in 1977. What started as acquaintanceship developed into romance. By late 1977, Velma had moved into Stuart's farmhouse. They lived together as a couple, though they didn't marry. This arrangement shocked Velma's adult children, Ronnie and Kim, who knew their mother professed strong Christian values. The relationship seemed good initially. Stuart provided stability and companionship. He had resources: the farm, steady income from tobacco crops, a comfortable home. For Velma, Stuart represented security. For Stuart, Velma was a companion who understood loss and could help manage his household. But Velma's drug addiction remained the dominant force in her life. She continued obtaining prescriptions from multiple doctors: painkillers, tranquilizers, sleeping pills. The medications cost money, more money than she could ask Stuart for without revealing the extent of her drug problem. Velma had access to Stuart's financial documents. She knew where he kept his checkbook. She understood his banking routines. And she repeated the pattern she had established with her previous victims. She began forging checks on Stuart's account. The theft started small, but grew larger as Velma's need for medications intensified. She wrote checks for $50, $100, sometimes more. She forged Stuart's signature and cashed the checks to pay for her prescriptions. She thought she could cover her tracks, that Stuart wouldn't notice or wouldn't question the discrepancies. But Stuart discovered the theft. The exact moment of discovery isn't recorded, but at some point, Stuart Taylor realized that checks were being written on his account that he hadn't authorized. He confronted Velma. Velma faced a crisis. Stuart had discovered her forgeries. She already had one conviction for writing bad checks. A second conviction would mean serious prison time. She would lose her freedom, her access to medications, everything. The panic drove her to consider the option she had used before. Before Stuart became ill, something odd happened. Velma visited Stuart's daughter Alice, who had recently taken a joking photograph of her father. In the picture, Stuart had laid down on a couch, closed his eyes, and folded his hands across his chest, posing as if he were dead in a coffin. The family laughed at the morbid joke. Velma asked Alice if she could see the photograph. Alice showed it to her, and Velma laughed along with them. But later, after everything that happened, Alice would remember that moment with horror. Why had Velma wanted to see the dead picture of Stuart? Velma purchased a bottle of rat poison. The poison contained arsenic. Before we continue with what happens next, if you're finding this case as compelling and complex as we did while researching it, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These deep dives into true crime history take tremendous time and research, and your support helps us bring you more stories like this. On February 1, 1978, Velma and Stuart attended a religious revival meeting. The evangelist Rex Humbard was preaching at the Cumberland County Civic Center in Fayetteville. Stuart wasn't particularly religious, but he knew Velma was devout. He accompanied her to the service, both of them dressed in their Sunday best. During the revival meeting, Stuart began to feel unwell. The discomfort started as mild stomach pain but rapidly intensified. By the time they left the Civic Center, Stuart was in significant distress. Velma drove him back to the farmhouse. That night, Stuart's condition worsened dramatically. The pain in his stomach became agonizing. He began vomiting violently. Diarrhea followed. Stuart couldn't sleep, couldn't rest, couldn't find any relief from the suffering. Velma was by his side, appearing concerned and helpful. In the early morning hours, Velma called Stuart's pregnant daughter, Alice. She apologized for calling so late, but said Alice needed to know that her father was frighteningly sick. Alice's husband, Bill, answered the phone. Velma's voice conveyed worry and distress. Later that day, Alice called back to check on her father. Velma said they both thought it was probably just the flu. A bad case, but the flu nonetheless. These things happen. Stuart would recover with rest and fluids. There was no need for excessive concern yet. But Stuart didn't recover. The symptoms continued relentlessly, draining his strength. Stuart Taylor spent the next days in agony. The vomiting continued, violent and exhausting. The diarrhea left him dehydrated and weak. He couldn't keep food down, couldn't rest, couldn't escape the pain that consumed his body. At 56 and previously healthy, Stuart should have been able to fight off a stomach virus. But he wasn't improving. Velma called Stuart's friend Sonny Johnson, telling him Stuart was sick and wanted to see him. Johnson hurried over to the farmhouse. He found Stuart in bed, looking pale and weakened, with a wash basin beside him for vomiting. Despite his obvious suffering, Stuart tried to maintain normalcy. He asked Johnson if he could take care of the pigs until Stuart recovered from what he believed was the flu. Stuart asked his friend to speak to him from the doorway rather than coming closer to the bed. He didn't want to transmit his illness to Sonny. This consideration, even in his misery, showed Stuart's character. He remained thoughtful and concerned for others, even as his body failed him. On the second day of Stuart's illness, Velma took him to the hospital. The doctors examined him and diagnosed gastritis, inflammation of the stomach lining. They prescribed medication and sent Stuart home with Velma. The diagnosis seemed reasonable for his symptoms. The doctors had no reason to suspect poisoning. Back at the farmhouse, Stuart initially showed slight improvement. Sonny Johnson visited again and found Stuart sitting up in bed, talking and smoking a cigarette. He still looked unwell, pale and drawn, but he seemed to be recovering. Johnson felt relieved. His friend would be okay. Then Friday evening arrived. Around 8 o'clock, Stuart took a drastic turn for the worse. The symptoms returned with overwhelming force. Velma called John McPherson, a neighbor and friend of Stuart's. Her voice carried fear when she told him Stuart needed an ambulance immediately. McPherson called for emergency services, then drove to Stuart's farmhouse himself. The ambulance arrived quickly. The rescue squad worked efficiently to get Stuart loaded and transported to the hospital. Velma followed in Stuart's truck, maintaining her role as the concerned partner. At the hospital, doctors worked to stabilize Stuart. His vital signs were failing. His body, after days of the poison's assault, couldn't sustain itself. Despite the medical team's efforts, Stuart Taylor died within an hour of arriving at the hospital. The date was February 3rd, 1978, just 3 days after he first became ill at the revival meeting. In the hospital waiting room sat Stuart's children, Alice and Billy, along with Velma. The doctor emerged with the news that Stuart had died. The physician expressed puzzlement about the death. A previously healthy man dying so rapidly from what appeared to be a gastrointestinal illness raised questions. The doctor suggested an autopsy. Both Alice and Billy looked to Velma, asking what she thought they should do. Velma told them, "If you don't do it, you'll always wonder." Stuart's children agreed to the autopsy based on Velma's advice. They needed to understand what had killed their father. Velma attended Stuart Taylor's funeral. She sat with the grieving family, placed a comforting arm around the pregnant Alice, and said what people say at funerals, He's in a far better place. Velma's adult son, Ronnie Burke, attended with his mother to support Stuart's family. As Ronnie left the funeral service, he made an observation to another person there. He said, "You know, it's the saddest thing, but it seems like everybody my mother ever gets close to dies." The comment was haunting in its accuracy, though Ronnie didn't yet know why the pattern existed. The statement revealed that people in Velma's circle had begun noticing something unusual. Death seemed to cluster around her. 2 husbands dead, her mother dead, elderly people she cared for all dying, now her boyfriend. The pattern was there for anyone paying close attention. But suspicion wasn't the same as proof. And in rural North Carolina in the 1970s, deaths of elderly people and middle-aged adults from apparent natural causes didn't automatically trigger investigations. People got sick, people died. That was part of life, especially in communities where access to advanced medical care was limited. However, Stuart Taylor's death was different in one crucial way. His daughter Alice refused to accept easy answers. Her father had been healthy, active, working his farm. Then suddenly he was dead after 3 days of mysterious illness. The doctors couldn't explain it. Alice wanted answers. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Bob Andrews. He found that Stuart had seemingly died from gastroenteritis, severe inflammation of the stomach and intestines. But something about the death troubled Dr. Andrews. The severity of the symptoms, the rapid progression, the death of an otherwise healthy man, it didn't quite fit. Dr. Andrews noticed an inexplicable abnormality in Stuart's liver tissue. He couldn't identify what it was, but it suggested something beyond simple gastritis. He decided to take tissue samples and send them to North Carolina's chief medical examiner for additional testing. Dr. Andrews placed the tissue samples in plastic bags and mailed them to Dr. Paige Hudson, the state's chief medical examiner. He requested more comprehensive testing to determine if something else had caused Stuart Taylor's death. Then he waited for results. While Dr. Andrews waited, Alice Storms waited too. A month passed. Her father was buried, her grief remained raw, and she still had no answers about what killed him. She was now a young mother. Her baby had been born, and she wanted her child to know what had happened to her grandfather. Alice contacted the hospital, frustrated and demanding answers. Why couldn't they tell her what had killed her healthy father? Dr. Andrews decided to follow up on the tissue samples he had sent to the state medical examiner. He called Dr. Paige Hudson to inquire about the test results. Hudson began asking Andrews detailed questions about Stuart Taylor's death. What were the exact symptoms? How rapidly did they progress? What was the patient's condition when he arrived at the hospital? Who had been caring for him during his illness? When Andrews mentioned that Stuart's girlfriend, Velma Barfield, had brought him to the hospital and had been nursing him throughout his illness, Hudson's questions became more specific. He wanted to know everything about Velma, her background, her relationship with Stuart, her behavior during his final days. Dr. Hudson's questions suggested he suspected something beyond natural illness. He told Andrews that preliminary tests showed signs of arsenic poisoning in the liver tissue samples. However, it was the weekend, and he couldn't confirm the results until Monday, when the full toxicology lab was operational. The weekend passed slowly for everyone waiting for answers. On Monday, the comprehensive tests came back. The results were definitive. Stuart Taylor had died from arsenic poisoning. The amount of arsenic in his system was lethal. This wasn't an accident or environmental exposure. Someone had deliberately poisoned Stuart Taylor. Dr. Andrews contacted the Lumberton police with the toxicology results. The case immediately shifted from a medical mystery to a murder investigation. Detectives from the Robeson County Sheriff's Department began looking into Stuart Taylor's death. The investigation focused quickly on Velma Barfield. She had been living with Stuart. She had access to his food and drinks. She had been present during his entire illness. She had encouraged the family to order an autopsy, which seemed like an odd thing for a guilty person to do, but perhaps indicated confidence that the poisoning wouldn't be detected. Detectives learned about Velma's criminal history. The conviction for writing bad checks in 1975. The prison time she had served. This discovery led them to examine Stuart Taylor's financial records. They found forged checks, written to Velma or cashed by her, on Stuart's account. The pattern emerged. Velma had been stealing from Stuart. He had likely discovered the theft. Then he became mysteriously ill and died. The motive was clear. Velma needed to silence Stuart before he could report her forgeries, which would violate her probation and send her back to prison for a much longer sentence. But before police could arrest Velma, they received unexpected assistance. Velma's sister called the Lumberton Police Department. The call was emotional. Velma's sister was crying, distressed, frightened. She told police that Velma had poisoned Stuart Taylor, and she said Velma had poisoned others too. The sister's call gave police the confirmation they needed to move forward with an arrest. On a Friday in March 1978, Robeson County Sheriff's detectives went to question Velma. They confronted her with what they knew about Stuart Taylor's death: the arsenic in his system, the forged checks, the timeline of events. Velma initially denied any involvement. She maintained that Stuart had died from illness, that she had tried to help him, that she knew nothing about poison. The denial was expected. Guilty people rarely confess immediately when first confronted. The detectives told Velma they knew she had poisoned Stuart. They explained the evidence, the toxicology results, the financial records, the witness statements. They pressured her to tell the truth. Velma continued denying involvement, sobbing and insisting she hadn't harmed Stuart. The interview ended without a confession. Velma left the sheriff's office, but the investigation continued. Police began looking into other deaths connected to Velma. If she had poisoned Stuart Taylor, had she poisoned others? The detectives' suspicions were heightened by Velma's sister's claim that there were more victims. That weekend, Velma broke down. She couldn't sustain the denial. The weight of what she had done, the certainty of being caught, and perhaps the relief of finally stopping the deception led her to confess. She told her adult son, Ronnie Burke, what she had done. Ronnie Burke faced an impossible situation. His mother had just confessed to murder. She had admitted poisoning Stuart Taylor and possibly others. Ronnie had to make a devastating choice: protect his mother or do what was right. After agonizing over the decision, Ronnie called the police. On Monday morning, Velma Barfield returned to the Robeson County Sheriff's Department. This time, she came with Ronnie, and this time, she was ready to tell the truth. What she revealed shocked even the experienced detectives who had spent decades investigating crimes. Velma confessed to poisoning Stuart Taylor. She explained that she had mixed rat poison containing arsenic into his beer and tea. She said she hadn't meant to kill him, only to make him sick enough to buy time to replace the money she had stolen. This claim seemed implausible given that the same pattern had occurred before. Then Velma confessed to more murders. She admitted poisoning John Henry Lee, the 80-year-old man she had been caring for in 1977. She confessed to killing Dolly Edwards, the elderly woman who had employed her earlier that same year. And most shocking, she admitted to poisoning her own mother, Lillian Bullard, in December 1974. The confession revealed a serial killer who had been operating undetected for years. Velma had murdered at least 4 people using the same method: arsenic poisoning disguised as natural illness. The elderly victims had seemed to die of age-related health issues. Her mother's death had been attributed to an unknown acute condition, but Velma's confession raised more questions. Her sister had suggested there were other victims. 2 of Velma's husbands, Thomas Burke and Jennings Barfield, had died under circumstances that now seemed suspicious. What about them? Velma denied killing Thomas Burke or Jennings Barfield. She maintained that Thomas had died in an accidental fire and that Jennings had died of natural causes related to his chronic health problems. The denials seemed convenient, but without proof, police couldn't charge her with those deaths. Detectives immediately ordered exhumations. The bodies of John Henry Lee, Dolly Edwards, Lillian Bullard, and Jennings Barfield were removed from their graves and transported to the medical examiner's office for analysis. The testing would determine if arsenic was present in their remains. The exhumations attracted attention in Lumberton and surrounding communities. Word spread that multiple bodies connected to Velma Barfield were being tested for poison. The case became major news in North Carolina. People who had known Velma, who had attended church with her, who had seen her as a kind caregiver, struggled to reconcile that image with what she had done. The toxicology results came back positive for arsenic in all the exhumed bodies except Montgomery Edwards, whose body showed inconclusive results. Jennings Barfield's remains contained lethal levels of arsenic, despite Velma's continued denial that she had killed him. Police now had physical evidence to support Velma's confessions and to implicate her in the death of Jennings Barfield. The investigation had uncovered a serial killer who had murdered vulnerable people, the elderly, the sick, her own mother, to cover up theft and fraud driven by drug addiction. On March 15, 1978, Velma Barfield was formally arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Stuart Taylor. The arrest made headlines across North Carolina. A grandmother and devout Christian, known for her church attendance and caregiving work, stood accused of being a serial poisoner. After her arrest, Velma was held in the Robeson County Jail. The stress of being incarcerated triggered a crisis. Velma attempted suicide by overdosing on prescription medications she had somehow obtained. Jail staff discovered her in time and rushed her to a nearby hospital where her stomach was pumped. She survived the suicide attempt. The next day, Velma appeared in court to face the murder charge. She pled guilty to the murder of Stuart Taylor. The guilty plea surprised many observers who expected her to fight the charge. But Velma's confession had been thorough, and the evidence was overwhelming. Fighting the charge seemed pointless. The guilty plea meant Velma avoided a trial on the Stuart Taylor murder. However, the prosecution had to decide what to do about the other victims. Velma had confessed to killing John Henry Lee, Dolly Edwards, and Lillian Bullard. Physical evidence confirmed arsenic in their bodies. District Attorney Joe Freeman Britt faced a strategic decision. He could charge Velma with multiple murders and prosecute each case separately. Or he could focus on one case and use evidence of the other murders to establish a pattern of behavior. Britt chose the latter approach. Britt decided to prosecute only the Stuart Taylor murder at trial. The timing of Taylor's death was crucial. He died in 1978, after North Carolina had reinstated its death penalty law. The earlier victims, Lee, Edwards, and Bullard, died during a period when North Carolina didn't have a death penalty statute due to federal court challenges about its fairness. By focusing on Stuart Taylor's murder and using the other deaths to show a pattern, Britt could seek the death penalty. If he prosecuted the earlier murders separately, the worst sentence Velma could receive for those crimes was life imprisonment. Britt wanted death. Britt's reputation as the world's deadliest prosecutor was well established by 1978. He had been listed in the Guinness Book of World Records for winning more death sentences than any other prosecutor. In a 23-month period, he had won death verdicts for more people than resided on the death rows of 2/3 of the states that embraced capital punishment. The case against Velma seemed straightforward. She had confessed. Physical evidence confirmed arsenic poisoning. Witnesses could testify to her behavior during Stuart's final days. Financial records documented her forgeries. The murder had a clear motive, preventing Stuart from reporting her crimes. But Velma's defense attorney, Bob Jacobson, saw potential arguments that might save her from execution. Jacobson was a court-appointed lawyer, one of the few in Lumberton willing to take such cases. He had never handled a death penalty trial before, but he was determined to mount the best defense possible. Jacobson's strategy centered on Velma's drug addiction. He would argue that Velma's judgment had been severely impaired by years of prescription drug abuse. She had been addicted to multiple medications, tranquilizers, painkillers, sleeping pills. The drugs affected her mental state, clouded her decision-making, and potentially rendered her unable to fully comprehend the consequences of her actions. The defense wouldn't claim Velma was legally insane. That standard required showing she didn't know right from wrong. But Jacobson would argue for second-degree murder rather than first-degree. Second-degree murder would mean Velma killed Stuart without premeditation. If the jury accepted this argument, the death penalty would be off the table. Jacobson also had to address the other murders. The prosecution would introduce evidence about John Henry Lee, Dolly Edwards, and Lillian Bullard to show that Stuart Taylor's death wasn't an isolated incident. Jacobson needed to explain how an addicted, impaired woman could have committed multiple murders if she wasn't acting with clear, premeditated intent. The trial was scheduled for November 1978. The venue was moved from Robeson County to Bladen County due to extensive pretrial publicity. Everyone in Lumberton knew about Velma Barfield and the poisoning case. Finding impartial jurors would be impossible there. Velma Barfield's trial began on November 27, 1978, in Bladen County Superior Court with extensive media coverage and packed courtroom galleries. The case pitted prosecutor Joe Freeman Britt, a towering 6'6" figure known for his formidable courtroom presence, against defense attorney Bob Jacobson, who, though physically smaller and less experienced in capital cases, came thoroughly prepared after months of strategic planning. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. Britt outlined how Velma had betrayed Stuart Taylor's trust by forging checks, then poisoned him with arsenic-laced beer and tea to avoid consequences for her theft. He described Stuart's 3 days of suffering before death and introduced evidence of 3 other murders following the same pattern of theft, discovery, and poisoning. Perhaps most devastating was Britt's revelation that Stuart could have been saved with an antidote called British anti-Lewisite if only Velma had told doctors he'd been poisoned. But she remained silent through his entire ordeal. The defense strategy centered on Velma's severe prescription drug addiction. Jacobson acknowledged her guilt, but argued her judgment had been catastrophically impaired by years of abusing massive quantities of tranquilizers, painkillers, and sleeping pills from multiple doctors. He painted her as a victim of childhood abuse and trauma who turned to drugs to cope, and whose addiction drove her to commit crimes she never truly intended. Medical experts testified about how these medications could severely impair judgment and decision-making, though none could claim she was legally insane or unable to distinguish right from wrong. Jacobson made the risky decision to put Velma on the stand, coaching her extensively to appear sympathetic, maternal, and genuinely remorseful. He repeatedly warned her not to argue with Britt during cross-examination. Her direct testimony followed the plan as she described her troubled past and maintained she only meant to make her victims sick to buy time to replace stolen money, never intending to kill them. However, everything fell apart during cross-examination. Despite Jacobson's careful preparation, Velma immediately bristled at Britt's hostile questioning and argued back defensively. Britt systematically destroyed her. "I only meant to make them sick." Defense by pointing out she had seen the poison kill her first victim, yet continued using it again and again. Velma's responses became increasingly illogical, at one point seeming to suggest she hadn't actually killed anyone, since the initial autopsies showed natural causes. The jury witnessed not a remorseful, sympathetic figure, but an argumentative woman who deflected responsibility and minimized her actions. The final, fatal moment came after Britt's closing argument when Velma made a gesture of silent applause, sarcastically mocking the prosecutor's performance. This single act of contempt horrified her own attorney and family members in the courtroom, destroying any remaining chance of avoiding the death penalty. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of first-degree murder, rejecting all arguments about impaired judgment and finding that Velma had deliberately planned and executed Stuart Taylor's murder with full awareness of her actions. Following Velma Barfield's guilty verdict, the trial moved into the sentencing phase as required by North Carolina's death penalty law. The jury had to weigh aggravating circumstances against mitigating factors to determine whether death was appropriate. The prosecution presented no new evidence, relying instead on the deliberate nature of Stuart Taylor's murder, his prolonged suffering, and the pattern of previous killings that proved Velma's repeated willingness to take lives. The defense offered testimony about her severe drug addiction, traumatic childhood, history of abuse, and argued she had been under extreme mental and emotional disturbance. Jacobson emphasized her potential for rehabilitation and recent religious conversion, but the jury remained unconvinced. On December 2, 1978, they recommended death, and Judge McKinnon formally sentenced Velma to execution, originally scheduled for February 9, 1979. Velma was transferred to Central Prison in Raleigh as the only woman on North Carolina's death row. Since no designated area existed for female condemned inmates, she was housed in a section normally reserved for escape-prone and mentally ill prisoners. The appeals process launched immediately, with Jacobson filing notice of appeal to the North Carolina Supreme Court, challenging numerous aspects of the trial, including his own inexperience with capital cases, inadequate venue change to overcome pretrial publicity, improper admission of evidence about other murders, and insufficient jury instructions regarding mental impairment as a mitigating factor. On November 6, 1979, the North Carolina Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision authored by Justice Britt, finding no errors in the trial or sentencing and affirming that the death sentence was neither excessive nor disproportionate given the crime and defendant. When the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case on April 3, 1980, which was unsurprising given that court accepts only cases presenting novel constitutional questions, Velma's direct appeals were exhausted, and her lawyers turned to alternative legal strategies. Multiple motions for appropriate relief followed, each temporarily staying execution while courts considered new arguments. One particularly dramatic appeal centered on testimony from Dr. Dorothy Otnow Lewis, a psychiatric expert from New York University School of Medicine, who claimed Velma suffered from dissociative identity disorder with multiple personalities. Dr. Lewis reported speaking with an alternate personality Velma called Billy, who allegedly took responsibility for the murders and claimed Velma had been a victim of sexual abuse. Judge McKinnon dismissed this testimony curtly, reportedly stating one of them did it. I don't care which one, viewing it as a desperate last-ditch attempt to avoid execution rather than legitimate explanation. Another appeal argued that Velma had been undergoing withdrawal from prescription medications during her 1978 trial, rendering her unable to assist adequately in her own defense or think clearly enough to help prepare testimony. The state countered with testimony from Judge McKinnon and trial observers who described Velma as appearing unemotional, stolid, and undemonstrative, but fully lucid throughout proceedings. Her testimony had been coherent and responsive, showing no cognitive impairment that would have prevented meaningful participation in her defense. Federal appeals proceeded through the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, both denying relief and finding no constitutional violations. By late 1984, after 6 years of litigation, Velma's legal options had nearly evaporated. Her case had been reviewed by 8 courts and 21 judges, with 5 execution dates set and stayed as appeals wound through the system. Throughout this lengthy process, one consistent theme emerged in legal arguments. Velma had been a victim herself before becoming a perpetrator, and her history of paternal abuse, addiction struggles, and mental health issues should warrant mercy rather than execution. However, when Governor Hunt denied clemency, Velma's lawyers launched a final desperate series of appeals. Attorney Jimmy Little, who had taken over her case, filed new motions in both state and federal courts, arguing she deserved a new trial or at least a stay of execution to consider newly discovered evidence. One motion contended that Velma had been incompetent during her original trial due to severe drug withdrawal symptoms in 1978, claiming she couldn't adequately assist in her own defense and requesting either a new trial or an evidentiary hearing to explore this claim. The courts swiftly rejected these arguments. Judges who had observed Velma during the trial testified that she appeared lucid and responsive throughout proceedings, with coherent testimony that demonstrated clear understanding of what was happening. While her withdrawal symptoms may have been uncomfortable, they hadn't rendered her legally incompetent. Throughout the week before her scheduled execution, Little filed motions in multiple venues including State Superior Court, State Supreme Court, U.S. District Court, and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, but each court denied relief. The legal system had completed its review and found no sufficient grounds to intervene. By Thursday, November 1, 1984, only one option remained: a final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. Such appeals were rarely successful, and the Supreme Court had already declined to hear Velma's case 3 times during the regular appeals process, making another refusal seem virtually certain. At midday Thursday, Velma made a profound decision that surprised her legal team. She told her attorneys to stop fighting, explaining that she had accepted her upcoming execution and wanted to die with dignity. She instructed Little to abandon the final Supreme Court appeal, and after 6 years of legal battles, Velma was ready for it to end. Little respected his client's wishes, despite the pain of giving up the fight. On Thursday afternoon, he held a press conference announcing that no further appeals would be filed, and that barring a last-minute intervention from Governor Hunt, which everyone knew wouldn't come, Velma Barfield would be executed in the early morning hours of Friday, November 2, 1984. Thursday afternoon became Velma's final time with family, as her son Ronnie and daughter Kim visited with their children. Velma spent precious hours with her grandchildren, Stacy, Wendy, and the others, trying to explain what was happening and why Grandma was going away. Kim and Ronnie stayed until visiting hours ended at 5 in the evening. The goodbye was heartbreaking, as both children wept while hugging their mother for the last time. And though Velma tried to remain strong for them, tears streamed down her face. After they left, she was escorted back to her cell for her final night. Prison officials offered her the traditional last meal of chicken livers, macaroni and cheese, greens and cake, but Velma declined. Having eaten pea soup for lunch, she requested only cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola for her final meal, and the simple request was granted. Velma was moved to the Death Watch cell, a small room just 18 steps from the execution chamber, containing only a metal bunk, sink, and toilet. Perpetual fluorescent lighting bathed the space, and unable to see outside, she existed in a timeless, artificial environment for her final hours. She spent the evening reading hundreds of letters that had arrived from around the world, offering support, prayers, and encouragement from strangers who opposed the death penalty, and fellow Christians who believed in her redemption. She also listened to religious tapes, with hymns and sermons filling her cell and providing comfort as she mentally prepared for what was coming. She had told people that she viewed her execution not as an ending, but as a gateway to heaven, and this faith sustained her through the final hours. Outside Central Prison, 2 groups gathered in opposition to each other. About 100 death penalty opponents held a candlelight vigil in silent protest, holding candles and praying for Velma and for an end to capital punishment while singing hymns including Velma's favorite. Across from them, death penalty supporters gathered to celebrate the execution, holding signs supporting justice for Velma's victims and arguing that she deserved to die for her crimes and that the long-delayed execution should finally proceed. Inside the prison, final preparations moved forward methodically. The execution would use lethal injection, a method North Carolina had recently adopted, and Velma had chosen injection over the gas chamber, believing it would be more dignified. The execution chamber was prepared, chemicals were readied, and witnesses were notified to arrive by 1:30 in the morning. 16 official witnesses would watch the execution, with victims' families given positions, though some chose not to attend. Alice Taylor Storms, despite her strong support for the execution, decided not to watch Velma die, feeling she had been through enough without witnessing the final act. Anne Graham Lotz, Billy Graham's daughter, volunteered to be present as she had befriended Velma during her years on death row and wanted to provide spiritual support in her final moments. Ruth Graham had written to Velma earlier, and Billy Graham had spoken with Velma by phone, telling her in a remarkable statement that in a way he envied her because she was going to get to heaven before he did. As midnight approached, Velma was allowed to make final phone calls, speaking with family members to tell them she loved them and asking them to take care of each other while expressing gratitude for their support through the long years of appeals and imprisonment. At 1:30 in the morning, prison staff came to escort Velma to the execution chamber. Velma wore pink cotton pajamas and blue slippers for her execution. She had chosen these clothes herself, preferring them to the brown prison-issue dress offered by staff. The pink pajamas represented a final small assertion of dignity and choice. Her attorneys had said they didn't want Velma's last sight to be of people waiting to watch her die, and lying down meant she couldn't see the witness gallery. Prison warden Nathan Rice greeted Velma as she entered the death chamber. The room was stark and clinical. White walls, bright lights, and a gurney in the center. The gurney had straps to secure the condemned person's arms, legs, and torso. IVs would deliver the lethal chemicals. Velma was escorted to the gurney and helped onto it. Staff secured the straps, not roughly but firmly enough to prevent any movement. The procedure required the person being executed to remain perfectly still while chemicals were administered. Velma cooperated fully, making no resistance. Medical personnel inserted IVs into both of Velma's arms. The veins had to be accessed properly to ensure the chemicals flowed correctly. Once the IVs were in place and tested, the execution could proceed. A blue-gray sheet was placed over Velma's body, covering everything except her head. At this point, the curtain between the execution chamber and witness gallery was opened. 16 people sat in chairs on the other side of the glass partition. They could see Velma, but she, with her head turned to the side, could not see them. Among the witnesses were journalists, prison officials, and Anne Graham Lotz. Warden Rice approached the gurney and asked Velma if she had any final words. Velma spoke clearly, her voice steady despite the circumstances. She said, "I want to say that I am sorry for all the hurt I have caused. I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain, all the families connected, and I am sorry, and I want to thank everybody who have been supporting me all these 6 years." The statement was brief and heartfelt. Velma expressed genuine remorse for the suffering her crimes had caused. She acknowledged the pain of the victims' families, people she had lied to, people she had comforted while hiding her guilt. She thanked the supporters who had stood by her through appeals and imprisonment. After Velma finished speaking, the warden stepped back. At exactly 2 a.m., he gave a signal. Behind a wall, executioners began administering the chemicals. North Carolina's lethal injection protocol involved 3 substances delivered in sequence. First came sodium thiopental, a powerful sedative. This chemical induced deep unconsciousness within seconds. Velma could be seen wetting her lips a few times with her tongue as the drug entered her system. Her lips moved slightly as if in prayer, though no words were audible. Within moments, Velma lost consciousness. Her body relaxed completely as the sedative took effect. She appeared to fall into a deep sleep, showing no signs of distress or pain. The witnesses watched in silence as Velma's skin color began to change. The change started at a spot on her forehead, where her complexion shifted from healthy pink to gray. The gray spread downward across her face, then down her neck, as circulation decreased. Her face took on the pallor of death while her heart still beat. After the sedative had taken full effect, the second chemical was administered, Pavulon, a paralytic agent. This drug paralyzed all muscles, including those controlling breathing. The paralytic ensured that even if consciousness somehow returned, the condemned person couldn't move or call out. The third chemical was potassium chloride, which stopped the heart. This drug caused cardiac arrest, ending life within minutes of administration. The combination of sedative, paralytic, and heart-stopping chemical was designed to cause death quickly and, in theory, painlessly. 4 or 5 minutes after her color changed completely, the prison doctor performed his only role in the execution. He removed Velma's glasses, checked her pupils with a light, and listened to her heart with a stethoscope. He pronounced Velma Barfield dead at 2:15 a.m. on November 2, 1984. The curtain between the execution chamber and witness gallery was drawn. The witnesses could no longer see Velma's body. They were escorted from the viewing area and taken to a designated room where journalists could interview them about what they had observed. 3 local journalists and 1 other witness agreed to speak with reporters. They described Velma's final statement, her peaceful appearance as she lost consciousness, and the gradual change in her skin color as death approached. All agreed that Velma appeared to die without suffering. She simply fell asleep and didn't wake up. Velma Barfield became the first woman executed in the United States since 1962. She was the first woman to die by lethal injection. She was the first woman executed in North Carolina in 40 years and the first white woman ever executed in North Carolina. The cost of the execution was calculated afterward. Lethal injection cost the state $30.12, far less than the $104.04 cost of cyanide execution in the gas chamber. Legislators who supported the injection method noted this cost savings alongside claims that it was more humane. Hours before her execution, Velma had signed papers donating her organs for transplant. She hoped her kidneys, liver, eyes, and other organs might help people who needed them. After the execution, state troopers rushed her body to a medical school in Winston-Salem. Medical technicians attempted to restart Velma's heart so her kidneys could be salvaged for transplant. The kidneys must have blood flow to remain viable for transplant, but the technicians couldn't restart her heart. The execution drugs had caused irreversible cardiac arrest. Despite the failed kidney donation, other tissues were successfully harvested. Velma's corneas were removed and stored for future transplant to people with vision problems. Portions of her skin and some bone tissue were also preserved. These donations represented a final attempt by Velma to contribute something positive despite the harm she had caused. Outside the prison, the candlelight vigil participants snuffed out their candles when word spread that the execution had been carried out. Some protesters wept. Others sang hymns. They dispersed slowly, many feeling that justice had not been served, but rather that vengeance had been sanctioned. The death penalty supporters celebrated. Some shouted, "Burn the bitch," during the execution, despite the fact that Velma was receiving injection rather than dying in flames. Their anger toward Velma and desire to see her punished overwhelmed any compassion for her as a human being. Inside the prison, inmates who knew Velma mourned her death. When the hour of execution passed, prisoners held lighted matches to their sealed cell windows, a tribute to Mama Margie, who had helped so many of them during their darkest times. The guards allowed this brief memorial without punishment. Velma's body was eventually released to her family. She was buried in a small, rural North Carolina cemetery, laid to rest near her first husband, Thomas Burke, a man she had possibly murdered nearly 16 years earlier. The grave marker was simple and understated. On November 4, 1984, approximately 200 people gathered for Velma Barfield's funeral. Family, friends, and supporters mourned her death while acknowledging her crimes. The service balanced recognition of the harm Velma had caused with celebration of her claimed redemption and transformation on death row. The case of Velma Barfield continues to raise difficult questions about justice, mercy, and the death penalty that remain relevant today. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe her execution was just, or should clemency have been granted? Share your perspective in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into true crime history compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into cases that shaped criminal justice in America. And if you appreciated the research and storytelling that went into this video, a like would mean the world to us. Thank you for watching, and remember, the stories we tell about justice and punishment reveal as much about ourselves as they do about those we judge.